The British PhD student Matthew Hedges, who was jailed for alleged spying in the United Arab Emirates, has arrived back in the UK after being pardoned.
He was given a life sentence last week but was pardoned yesterday after intervention by the Foreign Secretary.
Joining us from Land's End, Cornwall, is David Haigh, former managing director of Leeds United, who spent 22 months in prison in the UAE, now campaigns for others who may find themselves in a similar position. David, welcome to you. What were you in an Emirati prison for, and what were conditions like?
I mean, there were two instances in mind. I was the managing director of Leeds, and I had a commercial dispute with its owners. They tricked me out to Dubai on all sorts of promises, and then accused me of various things I didn't do. First of all, it was a thing called breach of trust, for which I was held for 15 months without charge in arbitrary detention. And then, much in the same way as Matthew's case, a large amount of media attention. So I was rushed through a court process, a couple of minutes each hearing, found guilty, then pardoned 9 days later, and then jailed again for 5 months for Twitter abuse, and then acquitted, and then sent home. And in between that 22 months, obviously, as many people know, I mean, I was tortured and I was abused, very similar to made to sign false confessions. I wasn't allowed access to lawyers. The same story that you see when Matthew talks, and anyone else that we see, particularly the Brits that we've helped over the last few months, it's always the same story again and again and again.
Did you form the impression, particularly as a lawyer, that this was a judicial system that was rotten to the core? Was it a case perhaps of rogue judges, or was it much more systemic, spreading from the government downwards?
It's a system that's rotten to the core, and I mean that's accepted by our own high courts, who refuse to extradite people to the UAE, and by the UN and various other such bodies and charities around the world. And it's exacerbated by the fact that you cannot. The country's pace has been so fast that the court system was bad at the beginning, but it's even worse now because it's not kept up with the country. So you have a system rife with corruption, and where local influence is paramount. And that's a real problem. And again, in my case, I was tricked to the country so it was used as a corporate jail, as a negotiation tactic, which is often the case. And it was 15 months before I was charged with anything, before I even was investigated or had an interview.
And the techniques, you did use the word torture,
Yeah.
And I'm sure you used it advisedly. What sort of pressure was brought to bear on you, and why?
There were lots of occasions, but it was essentially to get me to sign, first of all, a confession, then some form of settlement agreement, and then the police tried to get me to essentially pay them to smuggle me out the jail and across the border into Oman. And it was absolutely ridiculous. And in terms of the senses of torture, I mean, similar to what if you've seen other people that talk about torture in the UAE. They use extreme heat, they use electrocution. I was beaten. I spent, since I got back, 6 months as an inpatient in hospital, in various hospitals, trying to repair the broken bones, such as fractured cheekbones and post-traumatic stress disorder, from what they did to me, but also from watching what they were doing to other inmates, which was harrowing, to say the least.
Presumably, I mean, it sounds like a system which wasn't necessarily that concerned about the opprobrium of the British government, but there would have been inmates inside sharing your cell block, perhaps, whose governments wield even less influence than ours do, whose treatment was less lenient than what you got.
Exactly. I mean, it's a very, very, very racist country, and the British Embassy, up until Matthew Hedges, had been following a route of quiet diplomacy and telling all the inmates, as they did with me and many others, don't go to the media, don't be quiet, you have a chance of getting out, don't tell everybody what's happening. And that didn't work. Each and every time someone goes to the media, it's the media that gets justice for people in the UAE. It's not the justice system. And Matthew Hedges' case saw, for the first time, the Foreign Office actually taking a strong position and defending.
That's not just the UAE, though, is it? That's not specific to the UAE. I can think of 2 cases in the last year, the obvious one being the Nazanin Zaghari Radcliffe case in Iran, a perhaps less well-celebrated one being the case of the Chennai Six, who were 6 British, you know the case. And it was only when they rattled the cage through the media that progress was made.
No, absolutely, and it's a welcome change, and it's something that certainly in relation to the UAE hasn't been seen before in the way that the Foreign Office has been behaving. And if you speak to many of the detainees that come out, including for instance Dr. Ellie Holman, who was the young lady and a mother who was jailed for having a drink on Emirates. It's the same advice that the Foreign Office, even up until then, had been saying: do not go to the media, keep quiet. And people have been doing that, and they're still there. It's the ones that went to the media, and that seems to be the only thing at the moment the UAE cares about, because they care about their reputation and they care about all the money that they're spending on PR.
David, what do you say to those? I mean, we're not talking about a small handful of people, those thousands of people who, in a sense, almost enter into a Faustian pact and say, OK, I know that the Emiratis haven't got clean hands. It may not be the most incorruptible regime in the world, but the weather's good, the investment opportunities are there, the pay is good, there's little tax. You know what? I'll give it a crack.
Well, I mean, when I moved to Dubai, I lived there for 8 years, and I lived in essence a bubble. I didn't see all of these human rights abuses and things there, and then when I was there. But it's something that dawns on you, and I don't think anyone goes there. Perhaps now, though, with more and more media highlighting this case, the case of Sheikh Latifah, who's the daughter of the ruler of Dubai, who herself accused him of very terrible things against her, and she's missing and was kidnapped, and we're helping on that. There's a documentary next week. I think now people are starting to realise there is an issue here, but before, a lot of people bought into the marketing and the hype, and so they might not have thought that scenario that you mentioned.
And beyond, therefore, perhaps thinking about whether we want to spend time there and spend money there, is there anything more positively that the British government could do? I mean, I know you take the view that sometimes we help shape their legal system, even if it's by retired judges going out there and developing their legal system. Is there anything else that we could do, given, as you say, the rapid pace of cultural and economic change in the UAE that might make things work a little better?
I think the first thing is rather than helping them make their system work better, we have to protect our Brits. So we have to update our travel warnings. We have to update our investment warnings so that investors and tourists know the real risks, so that they know if they get on an Emirates flight and they have a drink and they get off that flight without an alcohol license, having drunk, that they're breaking the law. Because that's not very clear to people. So it's marketed as something that it's not. And that's the first thing that we need to achieve. We need to make sure that everybody that goes there knows exactly where they are going and what the rules are. And then in terms of the judges that you mentioned, we also need to consider that. It's not that the judges are improving the legal system. It's something of the opposite. It's they're being paid to essentially back up what is a internationally well-known corrupt legal system, which is accepted by our own High Court that it's corrupt. So they're essentially paying retired judges to give some degree of false respectability to this legal system.